Okay, then let's begin. So let's start right at the beginning. Here's a quotation that comes from December of 1913, right around the time when the Federal Reserve was created by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Now, the Fed itself didn't start its operations until 1914, but I think when you look at this quotation about why it is we needed a central bank, a lot of words will sort of jump out at you, and you'll get a sense of really why we have central banks. So, the American banking system has some serious defects. Now, keep in mind, this is more than 100 years ago. The principal defect of our system has been that the country has had no adequate protection against panics. No adequate protection against panics. Just think of where we were a year ago. Think of where we were in 2008 when panic was rife. So that from time to time, the country has been shaken to its foundations by the severest financial panics. We had that in 2008, throwing into chaos our commerce. Think about the past year, our manufacturers, our industries, and here we are in 2021, from which the recovery in some cases has taken as much as 4 or 5 years. There's a message here. Recovery from panic, chaos, a general sense of lack of calm in the markets can take upwards of 4 or 5 years. This Federal Reserve Bill is intended to correct the chief defects in our system. So what it was there to do was to create a central bank to correct the defects in a system so that the system is not shaken to its foundations by panics. Our commerce and manufacturers are not thrown into chaos. And frankly, we're able to recover from shocks to our system. Well, I could stop right there. And hopefully in a time period shorter than 4 to 5 years. Now, I remember when 2008 hit and we were thrown into the great financial crisis. And I was working at a financial services firm here in New York. And I said to my colleagues that I thought the solution to the problem was going to take upwards of 8 years. And I was immediately corrected by one of my colleagues who said, "Steve, you really mean 8 months?" I said, "No, 8 years." That this is a fundamental crisis in the entire financial system. And systems consist of industries. They consist of firms. They consist of clients. They consist of sellers. They consist of rating agencies. They consist of buyers and sellers of all kinds of securities, etc. Solving that is an 8 to 10 year problem. And it turned out that I was right about that. So the formation of the Fed came about because there was chaos. And part of the chaos came about because we were partially on a gold standard. And if it wasn't for the fire in San Francisco that leveled the entirety, basically, of the city of San Francisco in the early part of the 20th century, that caused a massive amount of gold to leave the United States, we recognize that the gold standard didn't work. But more than that, if you go back to 1913, we didn't even have a unified checking account system. The checking system basically was very, very crude. And on top of it, there were 10,000 different forms of currency. Right now, if you look at a piece of US currency, it says as the top Federal Reserve note. Back 110 years or so ago, there may have been currency that said First National Bank of Topeka, Kansas, or the State Bank of Alabama. There were 10,000 different entities that were issuing currency. You can imagine the kind of chaos that created. How do you control that exactly? So this gives you a sense of where we were with the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was created to overcome these things. So now move it to 2021. Think of the Federal Reserve in light of this comment as being here to smooth out defects, to smooth out drops in economic activity and make them less severe, to smooth out booms in economic activity and make them less severe, to make the economy perform much more smoothly. So when I was at the Federal Reserve, I used to call the Federal Reserve the grand smoother, because that's the job of a central bank, is to smooth out all of these variations in the economic cycle and in the financial cycle. So we have to think about what the goals of macroeconomic policy typically are. And for the United States, the first and the third bullet points you've seen before, and that is to generate full employment and low and stable inflation. That has been a goal for macroeconomic policy, especially for the Federal Reserve since 1946, where the Employment Act of 1946 said explicitly that the dual mandate of the Fed is to maximize employment and bring about a stable inflation rate. Underneath the surface of that is to bring output to its potential. And you know what potential is. Potential output is that summation of productivity growth plus growth in labor input, hours worked, or you can count it maybe as being the number of people working. There are different ways of doing it, but it's some combination of maximizing productivity and maximizing the labor input brings us to our potential. Hopefully you can have an economy that will perform at least up to its potential. And hopefully over time that potential will grow as we become more productive and as our labor force becomes higher quality and larger, our potential will grow. The idea is to try to get away from circumstances where, in order to solve that inflation problem, when inflation is not stable, when it is too high, to get away from the notion that you have to generate a large recession, to get away from the notion that, well, the way to solve a problem is the way that they make jokes about this in television sitcoms. But there's really a little bit of truth to it, and that is the way to solve inflation might be for us to become more productive so that we have more goods and services to buy, so that aggregate supply might be growing faster than aggregate demand. And the way to crush aggregate demand is to increase unemployment. So if you become more productive and you knock people out of work, that should be a solution to inflation. But look how painful that is. Do we really want a large recession in order to do that? This is always the dilemma. This is always the fear. Even in 2021, when there are those who think that inflation might be coming back significantly, the fear is that the Fed is going to look at that and say, then we need to slow up the economy. We need to knock people out of work. And to do that, we'll probably have to slow the growth of bank reserves and the money supply and maybe raise interest rates. That's a very painful way of dealing with that situation. But this is kind of the dilemma that you face when you've got a policy mix that focuses on maximizing potential while also maximizing employment and keeping inflation stable. Well, all of us have expectations, and we have used the word expectations before, most recently when we talked about the Fisher equation, which is, of course, saying that nominal interest rates, I, equals a real interest rate, R, plus an inflation expectation, pi E. Well, when we use adaptive expectations, effectively what we're saying is we assume that over time that inflation is relatively sticky. And all of us do that. You know, if I were to say to you right now, the inflation rate is, somewhere around, but probably slightly below on average, I don't know, 2%, which is the Fed's target at an annual rate for the core PCE deflator, core meaning they're not counting energy, they're not counting food prices. The PCE deflator, which is the price index set to each and every item that you and I buy as the household sector and is counted in the GDP. Well, what that's saying is that if you believe that inflation is, let's say, 2% now, probably you think it's going to be 2% tomorrow. That the world doesn't change so quickly that tomorrow in time period T, inflation is going to be very much different than it was one period ago in time period t-1. That's pretty much how we think. And because our expectations don't change that rapidly, it's a fairly safe assumption to think that tomorrow's inflation rate is pretty much going to be what it is right now. And that makes inflation expectations relatively sticky because we think tomorrow is going to resemble today. In personal finance, we talk about extrapolation of trend. We think whatever the trend is, it's going to continue to tomorrow. And we talk about anchoring of our expectations. We do. We anchor in our expectations. Indeed, the Fed would love us to anchor in our expectations of inflation. They would love us to continue to think that inflation is going to go to around 2%, a little bit over, which is what they want to see now because we've been a little bit under 2% for a long time period, but not 3 or 4 or 5 or 1 or 0 or deflation. The Fed is hoping that we anchor at around 2% and we build that into our expectation for wages, our expectation for interest rates, our expectation, say, for home prices, somewhere around 2%. That's the stickiness that adaptive expectations gives us, and it's a kind of stickiness that the Fed is hoping for. We call it anchoring at around 2%. It's like having a boat and throwing an anchor in the water and saying, okay, with the anchor in the water, the boat's not going to move. No matter what happens with the tide, this boat is staying where it is. That's what anchoring does, and that's what stickiness is about. Stop me if you have any questions as we go along. But then there's another set of thoughts that say, no, well, actually, expectations are pretty rational. That when you look at people's expectations for the future, it's based upon every piece of information that they have and can get, that people's thinking is eclectic. That means they get information from how financial markets are performing. So what's happening, say, to the inflation premium on Treasury inflation protected securities, where there's an inflation premium built into it. So the markets can tell us something. The yield curve can tell us something, the steepening of the yield curve, meaning way out, longer term, beyond 10 years, let's say, the yields that are gotten by people who are investing in Treasury bonds is getting higher and higher. Why? Because they expect more inflation. But we can also get it from sources that are not market-based. As I pointed out to you in the past, we do surveys of economists. So the Philadelphia Fed basically sends out a survey to economists and says, where do you think inflation is going to be at the end of this year? What about next year? You can get it from surveys. The Conference Board and the University of Michigan Consumer Research Center ask people like you and me, where do you think inflation is going to be next month, next year, the year after? They ask these questions. That information is available. But then we get speeches and testimonies by officials at the Federal Reserve, where they may reveal their thinking about inflation. Or we get the so-called Summary of Economic Projections, SEP, where the members of the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors and the presidents of the reserve banks, they put in what they think is going to be the outlook for inflation. And we get the range of their forecasts and we get the median of those forecasts. What I'm getting at is there's tons and tons of sources, loads of information out there that help us make our forecast or our sense of where inflation is going, which we call, of course, our inflation expectation. And then, of course, many people took this course that you're taking, and they took it in graduate school even, and they know how to think about inflation. They know which kind of data they want to look at. Maybe they want to look at commodity prices. Maybe they want to look at the price of gold. Maybe they want to look at the price of oil. Maybe they want to look at the CPI or the PCE deflator at its core or without its core, etc. They put it all together. They come up with their own forecast. So here's the point. When we talk about expectations out there, those expectations are built on a lot of different sources, and it can be eclectic. And that's the essence of rational expectation. Now, it would be hard to argue that what the Fed sees as its inflation target doesn't matter. Of course, it matters. And how they communicate that target, which right now they're targeting an inflation rate at or around 2%, with a willingness to tolerate inflation slightly above 2% for some time period, which is undefined. Of course, that's going to play intimately into the market's inflation expectations. The Fed is effectively the one controlling the valves. They are the ones who are adding reserves or taking them away. They are the ones that are adjusting short-term interest rates upward or adjusting them down or leaving them where they are. The Fed is controlling the valves. So at the margin, what the Fed thinks, what it targets, and then what it does, of course, is going to impact inflation, real economic growth, the ability to maximize employment and the like. Effectively, it says that the Fed matters a lot. And when I say the Fed, I also mean other central banks, whether it's the Banco de Mexico or the Bank of Canada or the European Central Bank or the Bank of Japan or the People's Bank of China. Central banks matter. They matter a lot. So let's now dig more deeply into the central bank in this country, into the Federal Reserve, into its thinking, into its mandates, what it does, effectively what keeps it going day by day by day as it pertains to monetary policy. So this is an extremely important slide. Note, this is slide number 8. And you've heard me say much of this, if not all of it, before. So de facto, meaning what they're doing in actuality, is trying to set conditions conducive to the achievement of maximum sustainable real economic growth with price and financial market stability. That's de facto what they're trying to do. Remember, I talked to you about that word conducive, or the phrase conducive to, meaning the Fed controls those valves that I talked about before, the growth of reserves in the banking system, the interest rates at the lowest levels, of the markets, on the most liquid assets. They do that. But there's no guarantee that even though they're making these adjustments, that they're necessarily going to get what they set out to get. Look, if you were privileged enough in your life to have a perfect professor, a professor who does everything exactly the way you would want and hope, and by any standards, any professor would say, wow, that is a perfect professor. This professor does everything that would be possible to make it possible for students to earn an A+ in his or her class. That's the perfect professor. Even if that professor did everything right, 100 out of 100 on everything by which you judge a professor, every student in the class is not going to earn an A+. Now, that professor did everything conducive to the achievement of A+ by his or her students. Not every student is going to earn an A+. Some students are just not going to do the work as effectively as others. Some students have personal issues, be they emotional or physical or with their family or their job or whatever, that make it possible for them not to earn an A+, even though the teacher did everything to set it up for that student to earn an A+. Everyone is not going to earn an A+. So this is what we're talking about. The Fed could do everything in its power to perfectly set conditions that will bring them maximum sustainable real economic growth, price stability, financial market stability, maximum employment, just do everything that you would want a central bank to do. There's no guarantee that they're going to achieve those goals because stuff happens. Even if the Fed was perfect in 2018 and 19, there is no way they could have anticipated COVID-19. They just couldn't. But their job is to try to achieve this maximum sustainable real economic growth with all of that stability, and to set conditions that would make that happen. How much liquidity is in the system? At what price? How is it distributed? Which assets do they buy? Which do they sell? What communications do they use with the markets? What interest rate levels do they set? Even if they did all of that, they're never going to go beyond setting conditions conducive to achieving their goal. But of course, that's the idea. Every really serious professor wants to set conditions conducive to students earning an A+. I would hope that most of us, if not all of us, try to achieve that. Some are better at it than others, of course. You've had wonderful professors. You've had terrible professors, I'm sure. And you've had every gradation in the middle. But even if we were perfect, nobody is going to be able to guarantee that all students will earn an A+. So, monetary policy seeks to smooth out cyclical fluctuations in the economy and the markets in order to mitigate deviations of employment and inflation from full employment. That's right, we're the great smoothers. The Fed is not goal independent. It is instrument independent. So what does that mean? The Fed is not goal independent. The fact that the Fed tries to achieve maximum employment, price stability, financial market stability, and set conditions conducive to maximum sustainable real economic growth. Those goals are set in legislation. The Employment Act of 1946, the Humphrey-Hawkins Act of 1978, the Dodd-Frank Act of 2008, all legislate what the goals of the Fed are to be. The Fed is not goal independent, but it is instrument independent, meaning how they accomplish those goals is up to the Fed. The Fed is independent within the government to use whatever instruments it has at its disposal to accomplish the goals that are set in legislation by law. So there are two different ways of thinking about this. The goals are set by Congress, signed by the president. Those go all the way back to 1946. The tools that the Fed uses, the instruments they use, that's up to them. And with different people sitting on the Fed's Board of Governors, which we'll talk about in a moment, how those tools are implemented, it varies from time to time. How narrow or wide the tool set is that the Fed uses has varied over time. The Fed in 2021 uses way more instruments, more tools than it was using 50 years ago. It has figured out more ways of achieving the goals that are set by law than it did 50 years ago. Okay? So I hope that's clear, that distinction between goal independence versus instrument independence. The FOMC policy decisions. I know this is always a terrible thing to say to students. Students become resentful of it, and for that I apologize. Okay? So I apologize for what I'm about to say to you. I don't mean to insult anybody. I never do. But I would say to you that anybody who in my class who has not mastered this slide, I would have a hard time giving a decent grade to. Come on, you can't come out of an intermediate macroeconomics class and not understand the intricacies of the Federal Open Market Committee of the Fed. I mean, I would be embarrassed if one of my students did not know who sits on the FOMC, how many times they meet, what their responsibility is. So please, please, please study the Federal Open Market Committee. I will digress for 1 second. Your textbook discusses it. If you go to federalreserve.gov, there is more information about the FOMC than you could ever want. If you go to federalreserveeducation.org, There's all kinds of information really written at the high school level, but that's fine. Facts are facts. It doesn't matter. I don't care if you learn from a comic book or from a textbook. It doesn't matter. And of course, all you have to do is Google Federal Open Market Committee, and you'll get thousands and thousands of articles. Ladies and gentlemen, you cannot come out of this class and not understand the FOMC. So who is the FOMC? So the FOMC is the group within the Federal Reserve that is responsible for formulating monetary policy. They're the ones who make the monetary policy of the United States. They meet 8 times a year as mandated by law, but they could meet more often than that. Oftentimes, they meet more than 8 times in a year, but legislatively, they must meet at least 8 times a year. Who are these people? Well, there are 7 members of the Board of Governors when every seat is filled. The Board of Governors, 7 members, each member serves a 14-year term. The math works very well. 7 members, 14 years, which means the term of one of the 7 members of the Board of Governors, who are actually part of the federal government, expires on January 31st of every even-numbered year. So what do I mean by an even-numbered year? Hey, 2022 is an even-numbered year. 22 is an even number. So on January 31st, 2022, the term of one of the 7 members of the Board of Governors will expire. Members of the Board of Governors are appointed by the President of the United States, but must be confirmed by the United States Senate, meaning there has to be at least 51 votes saying that this person is okay. 14-year terms, 7 members. They are part of the federal government, and they are paid as federal government employees. There are 12 Federal Reserve Banks scattered throughout the United States. Most of them are in the eastern half of the United States because when the Federal Reserve was formed in 1914, the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913, but the Fed was formed in 1914. This is where the centers of commerce and finance were located, mainly east of the Mississippi River. So there are 12 Federal Reserve Banks. West of the Mississippi River is Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, which has the largest land area of any Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. And I'm not sure about the positioning relative to the Mississippi. I think the Dallas Fed is also west of the Mississippi. It doesn't matter. There are 12 Federal Reserve Banks, and each Federal Reserve Bank has a president. And the president of each of those Federal Reserve Banks sits on the FOMC with the 7 members of the Board of Governors. So effectively, when there is an FOMC meeting, there are 19 active participants, 7 members of the Board of Governors who are part of the federal government, the presidents of the 12 Federal Reserve Banks who are not part of the federal government. So you get a very strange situation, let's say, that the president of the New York Fed earns more money than any of the members of the Board of Governors, including Jerome Powell, because the presidents of the reserve banks are not part of the federal government. Their salaries are negotiated. Okay, so that said, you have 19 members. When there is an FOMC meeting, all 19 members of the FOMC participate. They all say something. They all give a sense of where they think the economy and the financial markets are or going, and then ultimately it comes down to a vote on policy. And when there is a vote, all 19 do not vote on policy. Only 12 vote on policy. The 7 governors, the president of the New York Fed, either the president of the Cleveland Fed or the Chicago Fed in alternating years, and 3 other presidents. Only 12 of the 19 vote on policy. When they do, almost all the time, they will go along with the recommendation of the chairman. In this case, it's Jerome Powell. And you see a unanimous vote of 12-0. From time to time, there will be a dissenting vote, so it'll be 11-1. On an infrequent basis, it might be 10-2. You rarely see a vote where there's more than 2 dissents. So 19 participate, 12 vote. Most of the time, the votes are unanimous, but they need not be. There can be a dissent. So what would be the dissent? Let's say at a particular meeting, the FOMC decides not to change interest rates. And we'll get into that in a moment. There may be some member who says, you know what, I think we should be reducing rates, so I'm going to dissent. Here's why I think lower rates are desirable now, or higher rates are desirable now. And we'll dissent. Okay? Now, what they do typically is they set the interest rate target for an interest rate known as the federal funds rate. We will spend a lot of time on the federal funds rate. I will come to that in a couple of minutes. That's what they do. They're setting a target range for this one particular interest rate. The Board of Governors, not the FOMC, meaning just those 7 governors, also set a rate for the interest rates on excess reserves, which I also will explain to you in more detail. Okay? So basically, what is the FOMC? They are the ones who formulate monetary policy. The 7 governors, the 12 bank presidents, 19 people meet around a table with several other people. I've been to FOMC meetings. I've even written the minutes of FOMC meetings. They meet around a table, and then ultimately the chairman of the Fed, in this case it would be Jerome Powell, will make a recommendation as to what he or she, if it turns out that the chairperson is a woman like Janet Yellen was, will say, here's my recommendation that we leave the target range for the federal funds rate where it is. They will then go around the table to the 12 voting members, the 7 governors, the president of the New York Fed, the Chicago or Cleveland Fed president, and 3 others. They will go around the table and they will say, I agree with the recommendation, I agree, I dissent, in which case you'll end up with an 11-1 vote. That's how policy decisions are made. FOMC meetings take place typically 8 times a year. They are 2-day meetings. They meet a half a day on Tuesday, typically, in the afternoon. They meet in the morning of Wednesday. They make an announcement at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And at 2:30, the chairman, in this case, Jerome Powell, has a press conference to discuss what they did. Let me stop there and see if you have any questions. You must know the FOMC to come out of this class alive. And I trust that you will. I know that you did this in your introductory economics class, but there's really no excuse for not knowing the FOMC. The data and information are everywhere. Where do they meet? They meet at the headquarters of the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C., in a building called the Eccles, E-C-C-L-E-S, office building, named for a former Federal Reserve governor named Mariner Eccles. They meet on the 2nd floor in a beautiful big conference room with a very large table and a lot of seats around so that you could sit in the gallery and watch the proceedings, which are extremely boring, by the way. But that's in Washington, D.C. Do lobbies or political forces have any influence on their decisions? What a wonderful question. Oh, my goodness. I could talk for hours about that. Listen. Every one of the members of the Board of Governors is appointed by a president. When you get appointed by a president, the president is appointing you because that president feels that your thinking about the economy is in line with that president's administration's thinking about the economy. I mean, let's let's take an extreme. If you're President Biden, you're not likely to pick someone to go on the board of governors of the Fed who was a staunch Trump supporter. You're just not going to do that. So you're going to pick somebody who thinks like you do. Does that mean that that person becomes beholden to the president? So when President Biden picks somebody to fill the seat that will become vacant on January 31st of 2022, does that person become beholden to President Biden and say, okay, if President Biden calls me at 3 o'clock in the morning just before an FOMC meeting and tells me he wants lower interest rates, that I should push for lower interest rates, that I'm going to do that? I have 100% confidence that that is not the case. I had an opportunity in 1988 to get a letter from the White House asking me if I would be interested in interviewing to be on the National Commission on Competitiveness. And at that point, the president was Ronald Reagan. And I can tell you, I was not a Reagan supporter. But they had looked into things that I had said in speeches, things that I had published, articles in books, chapters in books, my own 3 books that I had written by that point, and they thought that my thinking was similar to that of the administration. When I went for my interview, I said to the people interviewing me that I was flattered to be considered, but I have my own integrity. I do not want to hear from anybody in the administration about what I should be doing on the commission. You picked me because you trust my intellect. Trust my intellect. I don't want to hear from you. I don't want to be pressured by you. And I tell you this because I have confidence that anybody who is appointed by a president to the FOMC does exactly the same thing. They go for the interview and they say, hey, listen, I have a reputation, okay? I don't want to be seen as Biden's boy or Trump's boy. I don't want to be part of your administration. I want to be independent so that when I go to FOMC meetings and we take votes as to what to do with interest rates, I want to use my experience, my knowledge, my skill to make that judgment based on the facts that are presented at that FOMC meeting. That's the Board of Governors. The presidents of the reserve banks have a very different pressure. The presidents of the reserve banks do not report to the Board of Governors. They don't report to Jerome Powell directly. They report to their board of directors. You see, each Federal Reserve Bank is incorporated and has a board of directors. It might be possible that at a particular spot in the country, there may be a political leaning. For example, the president of the Dallas Fed, and that's a position I was offered in 1995, and I turned it down, to be the president of the Dallas Fed. Little known fact that I don't know why I even mentioned it to you. I had to turn it down because my wife was very seriously ill and I needed to stay in New York. The Dallas Fed and its board of directors tends to have a particular orientation. They tend to be very free market, very entrepreneurial, keep government off our back, leave business alone. Just look now how quickly Texas has opened up. And has said, we want to get back to business. So forget masks and forget that we're opening up. Restaurants, 100%. Okay? That's always been sort of the orientation in the Texas, Oklahoma area. So obviously there's some bias there that might filter into the thinking of the presidents who sit around and make decisions at FOMC meetings. The Board of Governors, I'm confident that they are independent. The presidents, they have to be responsive to the wishes of their board of directors. And so it's a little bit different. When I was corporate secretary at the New York Fed, I sat in on all of the meetings with the board of directors of the New York Fed. And you'd be amazed. Some of them pull far to the left. Like we had the head of the New York City Teachers Union was part of our board of directors. But we had people who pulled far to the right. So it's a great question you asked, and I thank you for it. Someone just put something in chat. Could you repeat that?
I was looking and I just saw that there were only 6 governors instead of the 7 that you mentioned.
Right. President Trump did not fill a vacancy on the Board of Governors. He did that for political reasons I won't necessarily discuss now because I really don't want to, but he left the vacancy. That vacancy is there for President Biden to fill. He can fill that whenever he feels he's ready to make his appointment. Right now, his focus has been on filling his cabinet positions. My sense is that before very long, he is going to fill that position. It gets a little tricky because the term of Jerome Powell as chairman of the Fed is also coming up. And I think that President Biden has not filled that one vacancy on the Board of Governors because I don't think he's made a decision as to whether or not he will reappoint Jerome Powell to be chairman of the Fed. So we have some some decisions that have to be made by the president about this. There are some, to come back to an earlier question, President Biden is facing some pressures from the political left, Senator Warren, Senator Sanders, AOC, and others as to the kind of person they would like to see running the Fed. There's pressure from the centrists and the right, however, that's very different, that you would go with a very different kind of person. And that sort of leaves Jerome Powell in the lurch because it's pretty obvious that in the past 6 months to a year, his thinking has changed and has become much more sensitive to the thinking of the left side of the Democratic Party. And I think that's because I think he really wants to, be renominated, and he thinks that that's the key to his getting nominated for another 4-year term as chairman of the Fed. So we'll see. Good question. Oh, you're very welcome, Daniel. Okay.
Oh,
so
wait,
let's move on. We have, yes.
I wanted to ask. So earlier we covered that while the Federal Reserve is independent in the way it conducts its mandate, I think earlier you mentioned that there is a link of accountability towards Congress. So would it be safe to assume that even though the Federal Reserve is independent in the way it conducts its policy, that it always holds itself accountable to meet the demands of Congress?
I cannot tell you how fantastic that question is. Thank you so much for it. Hey, Jerome Powell is testifying before Congress today. He's up on the Hill with Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury. When the House and the Senate ask the chairman of the Fed to come to the Hill, they go all the time. They're required to go to the Hill and talk about monetary policy every February and every July. But if the Congress says, we got some questions for you, come up to the Hill for some hearings, they go. Now, having said that, the reason why there is accountability of the chairman of the Fed, or let's say the Fed to the Congress, is only this. If Congress really thinks that the Fed has screwed up, they could amend the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and take powers away from it. In that sense, they're accountable. But Jerome Powell could look at any member of Congress in the eye and say, I hear you, but I'm not doing what you want. And they can go to any committee and say, I know you are advocating for us to do X, Y, and Z, but while we are within the government, we are independent of you, and we don't think that that is in the best interest of the American people, American business, and American financial markets. And indeed, that's exactly the same thing that Jerome Powell can do with President Biden. Jerome Powell could get called to the White House. President Biden can say, as low as interest rates are right now, I need you to bring them down even lower. And Jerome Powell can say, Mr. President, I don't report to you. Has that ever happened? It happens all the time. It happens all the time. There were pitched arguments, I mean, where people could hear it down the hall, between Bill Clinton when he was president and the chairman of the Fed at the time, who was Alan Greenspan. And they would argue with each other, and they would yell at each other, and it didn't matter. The Federal Reserve does not report to the president, and the Federal Reserve only reports to the Senate and the House in the sense that they have the power to pass legislation and change the Fed. They never do. They never get into it to the point where they say, okay, you guys are keeping interest rates low for a long time, and we think that's a bad idea. You shouldn't be raising interest rates dramatically, and if you don't, we're going to change your powers. They never do that. So yes, twice a year, they have to go to the Hill. When asked to come to the Hill, the chairman of the Fed is never going to say no. And he's up there today. He's up there testifying this very day before a House committee. And he's sitting right next to Janet Yellen. So the accountability effectively, and I know this sounds Pollyannish, is to the American people and to the American and basically to the American financial market participants. What the Fed does, how it thinks, is manifested in how people invest their money. You will know when people are unhappy with the Fed by what they're doing with their money. They speak with that voice. And as for the American people, whenever you hear congressional committees talk with, say, Jerome Powell, they will get into questions like, what is the Federal Reserve doing about the fact that the unemployment rate among Latinx and African Americans in the United States is twice that of the overall population? They will ask questions like that, and the answer is always the same. We're sensitive to it, but the tool set we have doesn't address individual ethnic groups. All we do is control the money, growth of bank reserves, and control the level of interest rates. That's all we can do. We can't have a separate interest rate, say, for African Americans, etc. That's not how things exist. Somebody's reminding me that I need to talk with you about your exam, and I will do that in a couple of minutes. So what I will do is I will close by just talking today about the federal funds rate. I remember when I first started to work as an economist professionally, the first time I heard somebody refer to the federal funds rate, and I said, and I already had a PhD, by the way. I should tell you that. I had a PhD in economics already. I was working at CBS, the television network. Someone mentioned the federal funds rate. And I tried to pretend like I knew what they were talking about. And then I went back to my office and I said, what the heck is that? I went all the way through a PhD program and no one ever mentioned the federal funds rate. I had all over my notebooks, I had discussions of interest rates. So I had a lot of little I's and I had R's for real rates of interest. Nobody mentioned the federal funds rate. So I went into the office of the guy sitting next to me, a guy named Jonathan, and I told him this, and he said, oh, you're only talking about the most important interest rate in the world. And I said, what? I never even heard of it. What is this thing? So let me tell you what it is. Banks have deposits. And those deposits that are in there, are used by banks to make loans and investments on the one hand, or they become excess reserves. Or to meet their reserve requirements, everything else is excess reserves. So the total reserves of a bank, total reserves equal required reserves, that which they must hold by law, and then everything else is considered excess. If a bank has excess reserves, it can do two things with it. It could either deposit those excess reserves at the Fed and collect interest on those reserves, which is called interest on excess reserves, IOER, And that interest rate is set by the Board of Governors of the Fed, and that's only been in existence since 2008 or 2009. So that's a relatively new development. Or they could take those excess reserves, the reserves that they don't need, that were deposited somehow, that they have possession of, that go beyond their required reserves, and they can sell, well, let me use the word, they could lend them to other banks. So here's what we're talking about. You may have a bank with excess reserves. We'll call that bank A, has excess reserves. There may be another bank that is short of reserves. Maybe they made so many loans and investments that they can't even meet their reserve requirements, the amount of reserves they have, that they have to demonstrate to the Fed every 2 weeks that they have. They're short of reserves. Well, now you have Bank B that is short of reserves. Bank A has excess reserves. Bank B is short of reserves. You have a perfect market situation. When Bank A lends some of its excess reserves to Bank B, which has a shortage of reserves, they do so in a market called the federal funds market. And the interest rate that is paid on those reserves is called the federal funds rate. It is this interest rate that the Federal Reserve targets in the implementation of monetary policy. Right now, the Federal Reserve would like that interest rate, the interest rate that the bank with excess reserves charges to the bank with insufficient reserves. Right now, the target range for that is between 0 basis points and 25 basis points. Now, a basis point is 1/100th of a percent. So 25 basis points is 1/4 of 1%. As of this morning, that interest rate was 7 basis points, right in the target range. The federal funds rate is what the Fed targets because it is the most liquid of all the markets. It is just loaded with tons and tons of money in it. It's very easy to target this, and it's something that the Fed can influence, as we'll see in our next class, through monetary policy. So the federal funds rate is the interest rate on the most liquid part of the financial markets. It is the interest rate that banks with excess reserves charge to banks with an insufficiency of reserves and need them. They sell them or they lend them those reserves at an interest rate known as the federal funds rate, in a market called the federal funds market, which is purely electronic. So if I have more reserves than I need, I go into a site, I say I've got X millions of dollars, I'm looking for 8 basis points on it. Someone else goes in and says, I'm looking to get X number of reserves, but I'm willing to pay 6 basis points for it. Maybe they make a deal and they do it at 7. That's how it works. We'll come back to this on Wednesday. So the Fed creates a ceiling, effectively, yes. Now, under some circumstances, the rate can crash through that ceiling. Again, we'll talk about that on Wednesday. But in reality, yes, they are creating a ceiling, and I'll explain how they do that on Wednesday. So yes, that's effectively what they're doing. Okay. I need to be true to my word, and I need to talk with you about your exam. Almost my entire life, I've been in management. The first management job I had actually was professionally I was around 25 years old. And I've had management jobs throughout my entire career. And one of the things I learned in management, and I consider being a professor sort of managing a class, is that it's really, really important to listen to the feedback from your clients. You are my clients and so much more, but you are my clients. Ladies and gentlemen, you've given me a lot of feedback about that first exam, and you were unhappy about it. And I apologize for that. I didn't think that test was too long. I still don't. I didn't think that test was too hard. I guess I still don't. but you do. And I have to take your feedback seriously. So here's what I would like to propose. Unless you object, please let me know by sending me an email to smallonphd@outlook. What I propose is the following. On Wednesday, April 7th, I will give you your second exam. You will get it as soon as our Wednesday, April 7th exam, class ends. In other words, you'll get it at roughly noontime. And then I will ask you to submit your answer sheet to me the following Sunday. So you will have half a day on Wednesday, all day Thursday, all day Friday, all day Saturday, and most of the day Sunday to complete the multiple choice questions. There'll be more than you had on your first exam, but in effect, it will be a take-home exam. That will enable you, A, to open up your books and find answers. B, you can speak among yourselves. There's no way I could stop that, and that's fine. I'm just interested in you guys learning from the exam. And if that's a better way for you to learn, then that's fine with me. It will also help to boost your grades because I know you'll do better on that exam than you did on the first one. And hopefully you will find the exam to be a learning experience rather than a big source of stress. You're welcome, Tim. Listen, I know what's going to happen. There are still going to be people. The exam may be due at 11 p.m. Sunday, and there'll be people who will start that exam at 10 o'clock. It's what happens. But I'm giving you all this time because I really want you to search for the answers. And I hope that your search for your answers doesn't mean I call up my best friend and say, what did you get for question number 34? And that's what you put down and you don't think about it. I hope you will do this on an honor system. I can't stop you from talking among yourselves, but I hope you'll do this on your own. I hope you'll search for answers and that you'll learn from that search and that you will turn in a paper that you could be really proud of. So April 7th, I will put the exam on Blackboard. You will turn it in the following, anytime between that Wednesday and the following Sunday. So you'll have Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to work on the exam. Okay? Would you just excuse me for 1 second, please? Hello? Hi. Okay, I'll be right there. I'm all by myself, and that's my business phone, so I thought I needed to answer it. So I hope that will ease your mind a little bit. You don't need to worry quite so much. I still hope that you will study because study is really critical. Repetition and study. You know, I've advocated 15 minutes a day for 6 days a week and all that stuff. But I want to thank all of you who have given me that feedback. Yes, you'll still send the answers by email. Yes. Practice doing that with a Word document. And I do that because I think that's part of your training as a worker, is to follow instructions and fulfill those instructions. I know that sounds crazy. You think you're in a class, you're not in a working environment. It's the one thing I would ask you to do. I thank you for the feedback. You know, no good manager that I have ever known ignores feedback, and your feedback has been consistent. And I thank you for it. You taught me something. You've helped me. And hopefully you'll have a better experience with this second exam. So that's that. And thank you again for your comments and for setting me straight. And there we go. So let's meet again on Wednesday. Please look over this PowerPoint presentation and do the reading and read about the Fed. You know, you should come into the class on Wednesday and the FOMC should be emblazoned on your chest. I mean, you should know who these 19 characters are, where they come from, what they do. what the federal funds market is. Very, very important. Okay. Thank you so much for your attention. Have a great afternoon, and I'll see you on Wednesday.
Yeah, take care, Professor. Thank you.